Hey all, this is going to be a video that talks about the latest PvP balance changes and how effective they actually were, as well as where I think the meta will be shifting, so it'll be a little bit more speculative than the last video, but hopping right into it, the devs released a video where they talked about the recent balance changes that just came out. These changes directly affect what was on the patch notes, and what they alluded to there was on the patch notes that came out this morning. In terms of big things that catch your eye on this, the biggest thing I would say is heavy and medium have gotten generic Fortify buffs, where it makes it so that Fortify is actually relevant to those classes again. This was done by both increasing how much each Fortify value that was getting applied to heavy and medium was worth, and was done in terms of actually buffing regular sets of perks that are being increased and like kind of doubled in value, which is something that we saw with the VG initially, where they saw that VG's Rend was underperforming. When if they were to just move it over to be the new Rend type, so the old Rend type, so they doubled the value when they moved it over, and they're keeping that in line with these changes. What that did for VG is it made it so that in heavy it was essentially worth the same amount, medium it was worth slightly less, and in light it was worth a lot less still, and that should correspond with what these changes are. So in general, these fortify changes will make it so that fortify on actual weapons that are using these will be relevant again, which is a good thing. And then they've also looked at Shirking Fort, Sturdy Fort, and which is probably to combat LA version to a degree, and then they have looked at other fortify values in general. These fortify changes to Sturdy Fort and Shirking Fort make it so that they are, I would say, viable options in PvP. I would still say LA Aversion is generally better in the current meta that we're in, but if something like Void Blade happens to be good, if melee damage happens to be more prominent and Fire Staff nerfs are impactful, bow nerfs are impactful, I could very easily see the meta swinging back toward Shirking Fort. When you actually look at what the damage types that Shirking Fort covers versus Elemental Version, it seems very relevant and it seems very impactful. The main thing that Shirking Fort has going against it is Invigorated Punishment and how it works with that, since Shirking Fort is providing a buff to you. The Invigorated Punishment tends to scale very, very well and will make it so that at lower values of Shirking Fort, it is always worth less than Elemental Aversion, which is another reason why I still like Elemental Aversion a little bit more. But that being said, Shirking Fort is completely viable, I think, on this next patch for both medium and heavy classes, and Fortify in general is also viable. The main thing you have to think about when using Shirking Fort is it constantly proccing? Are you able to do that consistently? Do you need your stam for other things? Like if you're dodging naturally and you're going to apply the Shirking Fort naturally, that's good. But if you're playing something like SNS and you generally don't want to be dodging a lot, then trying to apply Shirking Fort will be a detriment and won't be useful for your build. The other big thing that happened here is with these increases in medium and heavy armor ratings, they've done this per gear piece, which opens up the door for more unconventional gear sets being viable. The only one that's actually in line with stuff that wasn't there before is, I believe, in light, you could use the gear set that involves using medium pants instead of a medium chest and one other medium piece, and that will actually bring you up to the same armor value as using a medium chest, which opens up the door for cheaper light bis that might be able to be sniped now due to these changes itself, because these changes apply per actual piece, not for being in medium or being in heavy. So that means in medium here, you would have normally two heavy pieces, which will actually make it so that this number is a little bit higher than 2.5%, and I'll edit in what that number actually is in a bit. Fire Staff had a bug where the Empower on Meteor Shower was lasting passively, which increased its damage massively. Fire Staff has like basically the highest base damage modifier in the game, which is stuff that bypasses Empower, and on top of that, they were getting into Empower Cap, which resulted in Fire Staff doing lots of damage, and as the devs mentioned in their video, it had a very, very high win rate across the board, versus something like Bow tends to be a little bit easier or tends to be a little bit harder to get value from a new player perspective, but once you're familiar with all the techs and you really build the bow correctly, that's where it starts to take over, and that's what they were noticing, which is why they also looked at nerfing bow. But Fire Staff has been nerfed kind of across the board. I would say Fire Staff is still going to be very, very good, but it will be a little bit more in line and won't be a thing where you slotting a Fire Staff everywhere is the way to go anymore, which is a good thing. Musket, they basically made it so that it can actually hit things again. The damage is still less, but from what I've heard, it seems like it is, I would say, viable, but I don't know if it's overpowered, which is exactly where you want it to be. But it's no longer not going to be used everywhere. I imagine they will start popping up again in OPR. Ice Gauntlet got a nerf. They mentioned in their PvP balance video that they're looking at nerfing Ice Gauntlet because Ice Gauntlet has a very high win rate across all PvP game modes. So that's something to be looking out for. I expect them to be looking at Ice Gauntlet's utility, but it's like kind of hard to actually nerf that aspect. You can't just tone a number down. The weapon itself needs some sort of like fundamental rework. Like you need to be able to go through Ice Shower. It just needs to slow you. It has to make it so that you don't just like randomly stop. If they did that, then I could see Ice Gauntlet being falling out of the meta for that second hand slot for a lot of builds. But that being said, if they do something too dramatic, and maybe it will just not be played at all, and people will move off from Ice Gauntlet. And that would also be bad. So they have a struggle with the balance there. For now, they've only reduced the Entomb's health, which I think is a good change. The main thing I think this affects is SNS weirdly, where SNS really use that Entomb health to be able to live like infinite debt pushes. I still think Ice Gauntlet's generally the preferred thing for an SNS to run, but is something that will be subject to change. For everything else, this doesn't really change anything because you were kind of forced to run Ice Gauntlet. There's not many builds that run Ice Gauntlet and have the choice for other weapons. The only one I could think of is Life Staffs, where some people run Ice Gauntlets in fort situations and in OPR to better counteract melee than Rapier can, since melee can now kind of cross-map dive you, and Rapier won't help you escape sometimes, where Ice Gauntlet will. Void Gauntlet, they fixed an issue that caused Void Blade to have tracking issues with targets. I'll throw in some Void Blade footage in the background in a video shortly, and then I can kind of see how that's been behaving. Haven't tested it yet. If this actually works, that's going to be fantastic for Void Blade. Void Blade has the potential to easily be better than everything else that VG is running right now. The main problem that VG has is the CDR is very bad, and Void Blade completely fixes that problem. But the problem that Void Blade had is if you're trying to light attack, it was so hard to consistently hit that it made it not really worth it. And if you can't light attack, then that CDR element that is very, very strong with Void Blade was no longer present, and it didn't really make sense to run the weapon. Bow, this fall off damage thing is similar to what they did for the musket. I think it will be helpful from an OPR perspective, but generally won't be as impactful as some other things. Think this damage fall off starting at 40 meters is pretty generous. I don't think it's a major nerf to bow. It's just kind of nerfing the, I'm going to sit in the back of the map and try to snipe people across the map, so you'll no longer be cross map from by bows. If you're trying to run from like your respawn outpost rush to center point, that's a spot where it will feel less dramatic. They've also decreased the hitbox size. I believe this is more in line with what it was at some other point when bow wasn't played as much. I think this makes sense because with the changes, bow is inherently going to hit harder, and you just don't want it to hit as often and hit harder. You kind of need to balance that. You either need to tune down the damage, or you need to tune down how easy it is to hit. I think this is generally more rewarding for that kind of style, where it's if you're really accurate with it, you're still going to get value. But if you are less accurate with it, and you're just kind of throwing logs down the lane in OPR and you're just killing people from that, then it's not going to be as effective anymore. The other noteworthy thing is the patterns for the event are now out. The patterns are really, really good for actually rolling bisque gear pieces. I would recommend looking for the patterns for the actual heavy if you're looking to go for physical version and refreshing. So this is particularly good for light healers, is something that is physical version just tends to be metaphor. But for other builds, it's not as relevant for the legendary patterns, but the actual patterns themselves are relatively cheap. They don't require actual gear mats to craft with, basically. You just need the pattern, you need your Asmo, you need your Phoenix Weave, you need your Runic, and you need your town buffs, and you need whatever perk that you're forcing. And then once you have that, you can craft one of these gear pieces. It basically makes it so that these are really, really cheap to craft, especially with the fresh start moving over to live that drove down the prices of Asmo significantly. So you can kind of take advantage of that now. If you have the Asmo, you have the Phoenix, you have the Runic, you could force something like Brazil or some sort of element that is generally good, and then just kind of hope for the best 2 to 3 per gear that you can acquire. There are some big buckets here that you have to be kind of be careful of. Like if you force Brazil, you could be in a spot where you're getting Brazil Angry Earth Ward, but it's nothing that is atypical. This is just kind of standard stuff for how it is. I think generally forcing something like Elemental Aversion is generally good. Elemental Aversion is really, really cheap. It's kind of meta across the board. It's just a good perk to have, and I don't think you can go wrong with that. But there's some other choices that you have in here, like maybe you want to force something with a weapon perk, you could try to do that. If you're trying to roll something really specific, this gear is generally not as good, but if you're trying to just roll in general and then try to make money off it, I think there's an opportunity to do that with this particular pieces of gear. Since you cut out the costs of the scarab that you would normally have, you cut out the costs of the generic mats that you would normally have, and the only thing you need are these tokens, which aren't super difficult to get. And let me know what you guys think about all these changes. They've also hinted at blocking changes coming in Season 2, which Season 2 should be coming fairly soon. I think it's like in maybe a month, month and a half, so relatively soon we'll have blocking changes. We'll see how that affects things. The main thing that kind of jumped out to me with this patch is they figured out a way to buff SNS again, which is very confusing to me, but that's fine. I think SNS isn't played in every single region still, but in the regions that it is played, it's definitely being played almost everywhere, and some people are trying to run multiple of the SNSs in different spots, which from a finding a variety of builds being meta, I think, which is what the devs are intentionally looking for. SNS is going to be in a good spot. I think Voidblade could be in a really interesting spot. The main thing that they were alluding to is they're looking to nerf Bruiser further. They're trying to figure out a way to make it so that Bruiser isn't as dominant in wars, which I think makes sense when you look at multiple regions perspectives in wars. Like in EU Bruisers and Disruptors in particular, which also can use Grid X, are being run a lot, and that's the primary role that is being run in a war. And the same thing is being happening in non-NA regions. NA tends to have a little bit more balance, and Bruisers are still meta, and they are being run everywhere, but Bruisers are in 2 spots in the group. In EU and other regions, I've seen it where Bruisers are 3 spots, or a Bruiser and then or 2 Bruisers and a Disruptor, which will play a Bruiser-ish role. So they're looking at kind of changing that perspective and trying to figure out a way to tone that down from a war perspective. I think at the end of the day, it's kind of a design of the game mode, because you have to play around the objective, and Bruisers are just good at creating pressure. They're good at clumping people up together and setting up other builds and forcing stam out. So they're just inherently going to be good in that environment. But it'll be interesting to see how they go about fixing that or nerfing that, however they go about that. But I would say in general, if you missed this last patch where you had Elemental Aversion and you're thinking about just keeping your Shirking Fort set, I think it's fine to do that now with these changes. If you're in medium or heavy, and then Fortify now, if you're in medium and heavy, is generally a lot better. I wouldn't say it's like insanely better, but it's like it's to the point now where it's in line with what it should be. I still think it's a little bit weaker than it should be, but it's not bad anymore. And I'll see you guys in the next video.